and welcome to On the Road to DevHops. Y'all know what we do. Bryan and I get together and spar, and every once in a while, we bring in somebody else that can really help us, well, mix things up. Bryan, who do we have with us today? Tell me a little bit about our guest.
So today we have Chris Swan joining us from across the pond, which is why I'm not drinking bourbon, because it's a little early. I don't want to keep Chris up too late. But I met Chris when I was trying to figure out how we could best secure our GitHub repositories or in public GitHub. But, you know, I work for a company that we do a lot of work that needs to be secured. So how can we remove the toil from applying the right security profiles to all of our repositories? And I was digging around and found some answers, both no good examples. And I discovered Chris, who had given a talk at QCon where I had also been speaking, and neither one of us had seen each other's talks, where he was talking about the open source security foundation scorecard stuff. And he helped me with some much better examples for how to remove the toil from standardizing your security profile on GitHub. So
that was an amazingly long intro to Chris Swan. Chris, introduce yourself. Who the heck are you? Nice guy that just appeared in our room today. Hello.
Hey, so I'm Chris. I'm an engineer at an end-to-end encryption platform called @Sign. Previously done all sorts of jobs in companies large and small across the industry. So I think I first bumped into Bryan during an all-day DevOps, or could it have been a DevOps Enterprise Summit, where I'd been talking about the DevOps dojo that we'd built at a company called DXC.
That's right.
And I think at the time you'd been doing a bunch of stuff with Red Hat. You know, we're interested in what was going on with that. But then more recently bumped into Bryan at QCon in New York, where we first got to meet each other in person. And subsequently talking about OSSF stuff, but that then led into a conversation about some research I'd been doing during my time at DXC on Agile, where I'd started out kind of wanting to just drive a wooden stake through the heart of SAFe, and ended up coming to the conclusion that all of the problems were leadership problems. And I guess that's what we're here to talk about today.
We're not going to get started yet, because we are going to ask, right? Normally we belly up to the bar in the evening, but as Bryan said, it's early in the US. It's afternoon, or heading in towards the late afternoon for you, Chris. What are you drinking this morning, this afternoon, this evening?
So this morning a green tea, this afternoon a red tea, this evening haven't decided yet. But since we're touching upon whiskey, I might just have a dram of some of my favorite Welsh whiskey. There's one distillery in Wales called Penderyn, and it's very flashy and new and sophisticated, and they turn out some fantastic whiskies, which I tend to pick up through the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, because they have some unique bottlings.
Oh, that sounds
you need
wonderful.
To send me a link to see if I can figure out a way to discover how to get my hands on some.
But Bryan, I think this morning you said that you are coffee or tea.
Well, yeah, I'm actually I'm drinking a carbonated, caffeinated, fruit-flavored beverage.
Oh, okay.
And you know, this evening I'll probably be finishing off a bottle of Woodford Reserve double oaked, you know, to kind of top off my weekend, which we won't go into.
So I am simply drinking a toasted coconut flavored coffee. I believe that this is mug 3 or 4. It was an early morning and I did not sleep well last night. I had one of those weekends too, Bryan Finster. And I am not a big whiskey drinker. I'm learning to drink. I call them grown-up drinks. I'm learning to drink whiskey. My gateway drug into whiskey has actually been a salted caramel flavored whiskey. Very smooth, not overly sweet. Mid-range, maybe $25 a bottle, nothing wonderful or hyper expensive, but for those of us who are very pedestrian about understanding whiskeys, it's a good gateway to starting to have some kind of whiskey palate.
It's like having a California roll to get into sushi, basically.
Exactly. So We chatted for just a couple of minutes before we clicked the record button, and it seems as though we are rallying around a real concern. That is not simply lack of leadership, but this chronic, almost a chronic wasting disease, chronically changing of leadership, chronic changing of command, and the trickle down, the massive impact it has, even down to the single developer, everything changing all around us. So, Chris, I want to start with you. Since you've been doing some research into this, you've been looking at SAFe and some other products. How did you find your way to this discovery? And it's a real discovery that leadership is chronic right now. It's sick. We don't have what we need to help drive humans forward and support them.
So one of the insights I guess I arrived at while I was doing the Agile research was there seemed to be in organizations bosses decreeing, I want you all to change, but I don't want to change anything about how I do stuff. And what sort of emerged from that was maybe just a fear that bosses had got to being directors and VPs and whatever with a certain accumulation of knowledge and skills and what have you, and that if they actually allowed some of the changes that would enable an organization to truly become agile, it would undermine their own personal investment in their career. And so hence came, I want you all to change, but I don't want to change anything about what makes me important.
That's an interesting observation. I've had a similar but not quite identical observation. There's often not a voice to help that senior leader to know what to do to change. They're able to say, I'm bringing in these consultants, I'm bringing in these mentors, I'm bringing in these coaches to help all of you. There's often not a voice into that leader. Leaders need to continuously change too. It doesn't matter where you are in the organizational structure, you must continuously improve. I'm wondering if part of this illness, part of this malady is that there's not enough voices there for the executives to help them change. How would you know how to change if you're, watching the people beneath you?
Well, and I want to talk a little bit about the very first exposure I had to actual effective change. And it was leadership attitude that allowed that to happen. And specifically, Kim Bowen, who is the senior director of distribution systems, and Randy Sally, who is the senior vice president of supply chain. And to your point, Chris, about, all you need to change, I remember Randy getting up on stage and talking about that specific problem and saying, no, it's all of us. We all have to change. It's not all you people need to change. But the specific behaviors that each one of them did was they asked us to go and figure out how to do things better as engineers instead of go do SAFe, because I also want to drive a stake through SAFe because I've suffered underneath it. Instead of going, we're going to bring in consultants and you need to listen to them, they told us, go figure it out. And then they would ask us questions about what was working, what doesn't working. I remember Randy, a senior vice president, and I'm just an individual contributor at the time, right? Him calling me into his office and asking, hey, in the old way of doing things, we would do something like this. And I'm trying to talk to the board and give them what this actually looks like. This is a Fortune 1 company, right? This is not like some little podunk little thing. How would this work in this new way of working? And then we just talk through it. And then he would go and learn from that and take that forward. And I'm like, it's just like I'm a few chapters ahead because I'm doing it on the ground. Mm-hmm. And he's just saying, please go do this thing, make it better. And having that attitude of leadership and trying to learn and continue their growth instead of I'm an expert is really what made that effective.
Well, that's a part of the change, is that, to the point Chris made, if they got to that leadership level by being the preeminent expert, leading other types of changes, driving other things forward, they are now at a point where they need to relinquish always being the ultimate expert in things and be willing to learn from their teams. One of the clients that I work with right now is in the midst of that transition, and they're doing a great job. Though I would say that they're in this tug of war between the old world and the new world and trying to adopt and adapt to those behaviors.
But, when you and I talked originally about this, you told a personal story about when you were in the Navy. And, the thing is that the story you told is from reading a bunch of naval and military, like history, which is what I do. I've never served, but good leaders are those leaders that delegate and learn instead of doing it my way, right?
Yeah. And what was intriguing for me with that journey was, so I joined the Navy straight out of school as a kid and went to officer training school. And they teach leadership there using a thing they call action-centered leadership, which I've also heard described as briefing by bollocking. So it's quite shouty. And this is what, the junior officers are being kind of told is the way that they should be interacting with the people in their teams. And I think especially since I was so young and kind of didn't know better, it just seemed like this was crazy. And I wasn't very good at it. So they sent me on the Petty Officers Leadership course. So this is the leadership course that's designed for the senior ratings. So enlisted people from sort of second level upwards all the way to, we had people that were 20 odd years into their career and needed to do this course so that they could become warrant officers because it was a tick in the box that they didn't have. So the sort of full spectrum of the Navy was represented on this course. But what they taught there was a thing called situational leadership. And that kind of is what it says on the tin, that one should adapt their leadership style to the situation at hand. So, if there is literally a fire or a flood, then it's probably going to be quite a shouty situation. And if it's anything else, then maybe you're spending more time listening and helping people figure out what they need to do. And so I think that gave me kind of two really great tools in the bag. So one of them was just this idea of situational leadership and adapting to the circumstances. But the other was knowing the capabilities of the team that I had. So I'd met this full spectrum of what the Navy looked like. And I'd spent time, a whole month with them, getting to know who they were and what they did and how they thought about life and what made them happy and what made them sad. And so when I got my own team at sea, I really clearly understood that it wasn't my job to tell them what to do. It was just my job to knock down the obstacles that were in their way and to help them be the best them that they could be as individuals, but also working together as a team. And it's kind of the Ted Lasso thing now. I think that show has just so brilliantly encapsulated what good leadership can look like and how you can develop a team to be as good as possible. But the kind of conclusion of this was when I merged back with my contemporaries who'd all been off and done their first sea jobs, I had not had a particularly hard time because I had a great team and I knocked down the obstacles that were in front of them and they did their stuff. And I knew that they could do everything that needed to be done in the department and more, and I let them get on with it. And so my kind of day-to-day admin load was pretty trivial. And so, that kind of ticked by, and there was plenty of time for, enjoying deployments and getting on with other things and supporting some of my other colleagues in different ways. And as I merged back with my contemporaries, they brought back the stories of, that was 2.5 years of hell. I just could barely do that job from one day to the next because they were trying to do it all by themselves. They were getting their stack of paperwork every day and trying to do it all rather than delegating and trusting the team. And in doing so, they'd made life hell for themselves, but they'd also missed so many opportunities to develop the team and give them opportunities to grow.
And I had a parallel thing. I didn't have any training on it. It just happened organically when I was on this mission. We were told to try to solve this continuous delivery problem, and I was a Shouty directive tech lead. If I couldn't do it all myself, then I was failing, and I couldn't do that. And I got moved onto a team where I didn't know the tech stack. We were changing everything about what we were doing, what we were coding in and how we were coding it. And my mission was to figure out continuous delivery, not to be a Shouty Tech Lead. And I had to go and like remove obstacles from the team. I told the team my job as tech lead was to remove the technical obstacles, and I pushed the product owner to removing product obstacles. And I said, that's our job. They're the ones actually delivering value. Mm-hmm. Completely changed my approach to how I was trying to be a technical lead on the team, and I had the same outcome. It's like things were a lot easier. Just trusted the team. There was tried to bring out the best of people who didn't have skills in one area but leverage the skills in another area. And I learned that that's a much better way of doing things.
You're both really highlighting a mental model shift from where people have grown throughout their careers. Many have been taught that there is an individualism, there's a bit of a competition, there's a showmanship. All of those things are clearly still there, and yet we need to set those aside and be focused on the business or the mission. What are we trying to accomplish? One of the things that you said, Chris, was the training that you got about that situational awareness. We have a number of different types of leaders who are not adaptive to those situations, and I think that becomes very difficult. You also had the mental ability to trust and validate what was going on. I'm seeing both leadership changing as well as team membership changing so rapidly that as soon as I feel that I know Chris, I know just enough about him, I've gotten to spend a little bit of time with him, he's off onto the next thing. So I'm not personally getting enough of that long-lived aspect for there to be the relationship building, and relationships are core to what we're talking about here. I cannot lead a person I don't know other than, well, I suppose you can, but not in that long-term impactful way, not with that depth of trust that needs to be there. How do you deal with that turnover?
Turnover was, sorry, Bryan.
Well, I just wanted to tell a quick story, because this is important. This is, the company I work for, we do a lot of federal government work. And this is endemic in the government, because the government has spent so many decades outsourcing work to contracting companies where the turnover rate is super, super high. We actually have somebody who joined recently who's just retired from the Air Force last week. And he was literally told that he wasn't a contractor, so he couldn't develop, even though his job in the Air Force was a developer, right? He wasn't allowed to touch a keyboard. All he could do was direct. But then you have contractors just, the turnover is so fast, it's really hard to get that stability you need to deliver good product.
Well, my role in the government is to try to help and reverse that, Bryan. So the government in the US for a long time has outsourced everything. And there were some good reasons for it 25 years ago when they didn't have the educational resources, they didn't have the wherewithal to be able to conduct everything. And some of these massive defense industrial based organizations could say, oh, you need a jet? I can design it, I can build it, I can deliver it, I can do all of those things. And they would do that. So there was a certain outsourcing of ownership. And they're at that point right now, Bryan, of swinging the pendulum back so that they're not only oversight, so that they have the technical expertise, but we're at that inflection point. So I agree with you in the government space in particular. They are often, even the leaders who are government employees, they're on a 1 or a 2 year cycle. So by the time they get their footing on a multi-million or potentially $1 billion program, it takes them 6 months to a year to get their footing. And at that point, they have 6 months to make change, and then they're off to the next 6 months of offloading to move on to the next thing. So there's I call it the meantime to command change. It's actually the shakedown, the shake up that happens within an organization when your leadership is constantly coming in, getting situational awareness. You have to educate them, and then they move on. And so it's almost as though I don't need that leadership. If you could go over here, we'll have a next level of leadership, an implied level of leadership that's a step lower, so we can keep doing things.
You know, we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, and a few months ago, I snarkily posted about mean time to leadership change is a metric we should be tracking. And Chris, you made a really good point.
Those aren't leaders in many cases. And so, we touched upon this word command a little, and leader, and John Smart does a really good kind of, differences between command and leadership in many of his presentations. And it's, super relevant. The other word that we haven't really used a great deal yet is management. But I think a lot of this comes from the hierarchical structure of organizations and what people are taught to do and expect as junior managers, and behaviors that emerge from that. And those successful behaviors of a junior manager just kind of being repeated as a senior manager. And there's quite often a bit of Peter principle comes in here, which is everybody getting promoted kind of one notch just beyond what they're really capable of holding down. But I'd like to also go back to this sort of short tenure thing, because that's absolutely a feature of military life. And I think choosing early in my career a military approach was one where I really looked forward to the fact that I could choose to change job every couple of years and have a fresh challenge and be able to do something different. But I think every job that I stepped into, there was a sense of continuity, that you were only the caretaker for it. You weren't expected to kind of change it beyond all recognition. And I think when you're then dealing with things that are perhaps more strategic, and people are trying to make their stamp on that by changing the direction of the strategy, that has to be done with enormous care. Because if every person's coming along and saying, actually, I want to change the direction of this, it can become a bit gratuitous. Mm-hmm. We see problems with, say, Gmail, where it's kind of, every time they change the Gmail UI, it's because somebody in Google needed to point at something to say, this is what I did to get promoted. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily healthy for us as users of that stuff. And is there a coherent strategy behind it? I'd wish to see evidence of that.
But you bring up such a poignant point, and that is the feeling or the imperative to balance between being caretaker and driving change. It's a tremendous balance. There is a certain continuity that you want, and not having a steady hand at the rudder becomes very difficult for the people on the ground doing the work. If the leadership is consistently changing and the directional changes that they're making are not necessarily in the best interest of the mission or the best interest of providing business value, they are making their stamp, they're applying their rubber stamp to it. That has amazing trickle down onto everybody, because people begin to disengage. You need everybody to believe in the mission. You need everybody to believe in the business, in what they're trying to accomplish. And if you don't think that your leadership is earnest, if you don't believe in their conviction towards it, if you believe that they're doing this to get a mark by their name, they're no longer a leader, they're a commander, and you do kind of step back. You disengage.
So Chris and I, we had I had planned a very short technical conversation to get some tips from him, and it turned into a wide-ranging thing, and Chris was talking about how, I'll let you tell the story, but you were working on a book, right? And my wife and I have a book planned, which I think is the punchline to his book that he had planned. So do you want to talk about that, Chris?
Yeah, so I'd been helping to lead the DevOps transformation of a chunk of DXC, and we've been able to make some substantial progress inside of what was otherwise a sort of large and difficult to change organization. And so I had a chat with Gene Kim about the How We Did It book, and we barely got a few hundred words into drafts in a GitHub repo, myself and my co-author, before we had the rug pulled on us, and we lost the executive who'd been giving us air cover, and it was just everything that we managed to accomplish was falling apart in front of our eyes. And the idea that we would have the hubris to then write a book about this great thing that we'd done when it obviously wasn't sustainable in that changed set of circumstances just meant that the book was never going to get written. But I think this is kind of revealing of the problem that we're here to talk about, that if you have these pendulum swings in senior command, let's call it, where somebody comes along and maybe doesn't even take the time to understand what was happening and why. And I think there's very often a sort of sentiment kind of comes along that when a senior executive is pushed out, that everything that they touched is kind of poisoned with the bad thinking that drove the decision that led to their ejection. And so there can't possibly be anything good here. And all of those people are part of the problem, not part of the solution. And so we don't talk to them because they've not got any useful insights to share.
But that's an awful universal brushstroke, though. I mean, they may have been pushed out, but they may have elected to move on their own. I mean, that's a tremendous.
Even move on their own. I've seen the same thing happen. So we had the executive who was, leading, driving the mission, the CTO driving the mission that was causing a lot of improvement where I was working before. He left on his own. And then there was a long pause while they tried to go find another CTO, and there was an interim CTO, and he didn't change anything, but he didn't push anything either. And, the change requires push. But we also lost the VP of platform, and all of the strategy was being driven by platform. Okay. Not by some Agile organization. It was driven by platform. And he left voluntarily to go join a startup. New VP platform came in, and he brought in his team and ignored everything that had been going on. In fact, told the dojo they should be teaching safe, which the whole team said, we'll quit if you make us teach safe, right? And it just didn't talk to any of us. I had my direct manager, the director of delivery platform, trying to reach out and talk about all the stuff that, from a platform strategy and from a, change strategy and all the things we're doing, ignored us entirely.
But the theme that I'm hearing here, and maybe this is where we should be writing about this, is it shouldn't all be about the success stories. And we do want to write about the success stories. Here's your exemplar. Here's the things that we did that worked well. I think that we should be talking about this exact situation. As you are starting to make change, what does it mean to make it sustainable? And what happens when leadership or command or management, and they are different, when those things change? What are some of the anti-patterns that come to the surface? Like, maybe that's what we should be talking about, is what are the anti-patterns and what are behaviors that we can help based on your level, based on your role. How can you help to maybe steer away from that anti-pattern that's making its way into the organization.
And this was the conversation I had with Chris, because he told me about his book they were working on. I was like, oh yeah, well, my wife and I have been giving a talk that is the intention is to be a preamble to a book called The Rise and Fall of DevOps that talks about this exact problem, about how you see the success and you get people excited. And, we have like these 6 links, right? It's like if you don't forge these links or you break one of the links, it's all going to fall apart. Mission's one of those links, right? It requires good leadership to have vision, right? And it talks about you have this change, and leadership is something we point out in this talk, and it falls apart. You could wind up worse than you were before, worse than you began, because the people become disengaged because they got excited about seeing things improve, and then things start falling apart and go back to the way it was before. It won't go back to the way it was before because you've shown people it can be better than that, and now you've pissed them off, and it gets worse.
Very true. So, Chris, are you going to continue with your book, or are you going to repivot, change?
That book will never be written.
Although I need to pick your brain as an example for the book we need to write.
Or maybe it's not a book. Maybe it's a series exactly like what we're doing now of parsing out. We need to tease out what these anti-patterns are. We're all talking about symptomatic. We're talking about some causation. We need to be more articulate. These are the symptoms that you're going to see, and here's some ways to address it. And as long as we don't put a racy chart out, I'll be happy. I wanted to share with you, Chris, I have some mid-level folks, and as soon as they're getting exposed to this, to modern software practices, the first thing that they do is they sit down and hand me a racy. So is this how we're going to do this? I'm like, hey, I don't know what this is. What are all these roles, and why are they? Stop. Let's talk about what's our mission. What's the business at hand? What do we need to accomplish? Let's not worry about a racy yet. There's this interesting pendulum swing that comes with folks who are exposed to continuous delivery, continuous improvement for the first time.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I love startup life, because you, especially in the organization I'm at the moment, we have a flat management structure. And so we don't spend any time on races because people just swarm around what needs to get done. And it's very empowering, especially for the junior members of the team. And it cuts out so much time that I think we spend kind of worrying about this stuff and fretting about it and arguing about it quite often in larger organizations.
But I'm going to bring up another anti-pattern that happens, and I'm seeing this as well, as I am pushing people to say, let's identify the work and then have people rally and swarm to address the work. I'm actually seeing what I call bumblebee football or bumblebee soccer. Everybody chases the next problem. So when there's, instead of people sticking and staying focused on the problem that we identified yesterday, we rallied people to do, we focused them on it. When the next problem comes, the entire organization rushes to that next new thing instead of completing, or I can't even say completing, instead of addressing and making what they're doing sustainable, instead of delivering that. I'm seeing this constant running after the ball by the entire organization.
This is something you and I have talked about before. We talked about, kind of touched on it. We did an episode talking about having team autonomy and what it looks like when you have excessive autonomy on a team. And one of the anti-patterns of that is, and this goes back to leadership, right? It's just a lack of leadership, is that if everybody just goes and solves a problem that they see instead of finding out, number one, is somebody else already working on this problem, or is it already solved and I just don't know it, but I see this problem, and it's something that you're always trying to play whack-a-mole on, unless you as a leader actually take things like organizational design seriously. The reason we are able to keep that under control in platform at Walmart was that we designed product teams that each with products that had discrete sets of problems that they were trying to solve on each product. So we didn't have people stomping on each other. And if people needed documentation, they didn't go and invent a new way to document their product. They went to the documentation team and said, hey, I need a website for my documentation, right? And so we had, that way people could swarm around the problems that they had in front of them without swarming around all problems that possibly might exist.
And there's also FOMO, right? There's a fear of missing out that's going on constantly because people are interested in the newness of something that's coming along. And so that's another piece of it. But you bring up a good point on organizational structure, Bryan. Traditional organizational redesign became so heavy, so bloated, so big, so dogmatic, so top down, that when you talk about changing structure, people automatically assume that it's going to be 6 months to a year worth of studying it and creating these new matrices and organization. We need to just pause. We need to breathe. We need a whiteboard. We need a couple of circles. We need to identify what the big things are. And we need to kind of club people towards the big rock areas. It's simpler than people make it out to be.
The talk I gave at QCon was literally about, part of it was how we went on a whiteboard and instead of, and I want to talk about a hypothesis I have. I just thought of when we were talking. I want your feedback on it because it relates to military, Chris, so maybe you have some input. But we literally drew on a whiteboard the business problems we needed to form teams around, the business capabilities we wanted to form teams around. We just drew it on a whiteboard and we presented it to leadership. And so this is where we should start. Most of the argument was identifying what the business problems actually were. It wasn't how we should structure the teams after that. But the hypothesis I have, Chris, because you're talking about RASCI charts, Tracy, and role specialization. My hypothesis is that role specialization is an outcome of trying to compensate for lack of competence, really. That if you have role specialization in like the standard infantry, where you have like people coming in, they're going to be in for 4 years, they're going to get out, they don't have a lot of time to get good at their jobs. But special forces, they're generalists, right? They have to do a bunch of stuff, but they have a lot of training and get it done. And if you just default go for, we're going to have specialized roles, then you're never going to have high performing teams.
Oh, but there's such a mix. There's such a mix between specialists and generalists that I would say even the special forces are specialist generalists. They're not just generalists. They're not like the guy I'm going to,
well, but
they are highly specialized, but in a whole lot of things. Chris, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, like, for example, I'm not a product specialist. I don't know how to go and market a brand new product, right? So I would agree. But Chris, what was your?
Oh, so many thoughts on this. So first of all, I think the most important skill in modern times is being a quick study, being able to learn something and effectively turn that around into impactful action. And a few years back, I was trying to hire people for that skill. Specifically, that's what I wanted on my team. And HR just couldn't help me. The entire recruitment process was kind of built around looking at resumes and how many years of experience people had with stuff. And I said, I want almost the opposite of that. It's kind of apply your normal filters and then give me the residue, because those will be the interesting people that I like doing a new thing and a new thing and a new thing and a new thing. And actually we did that. And I was able to hire some incredible people onto that team. But sort of stepping beyond that, back to the military thing, one of the collaborators on the Agile research was a guy who goes by the Twitter handle of Commando Dev. So he's a former Royal Marines commando who started learning IT stuff when he was deployed out in Afghanistan, I think it was, and subsequently became a functional programmer. And so he's taken what he learned, being kind of at that cusp of special forces and what he's subsequently learned in tech, and kind of brought them together. And I think it really does go together. And that was part of what led me to this conclusion of, actually, our problem here is we don't even have Leadership 101 in many of these commanders that are trying to make these changes in organizations. And maybe if we could just do Leadership 101, that would be the beginning of the journey to get there. And so absolutely, I think we need to be not thinking about skills in terms of building up years of experience to be a specialist in some little niche, but rather thinking about what problems do I need to solve today? What do I need to learn to solve those problems? And can I, out of that, create something that's part of a sustainable solution rather than being today's addition to the pile of tech debt? And that last bit is the real knack, because I think we work in an industry where there's nothing as permanent as a quick, hacky, temporary fix. And it's just then being mature in our approach to building systems. And so a lot of what I see happening right now is kind of people decrying DevOps and saying, oh, we need to be doing platform engineering instead. It's like we were always doing that. And the DevOps movement has given us lots of better ways to talk about that and think about that. But I think one of the things that the DevOps movement might have just got a tiny bit wrong was this point of it's not about tools. Because we've always talked about DevOps being about a culture and the change necessary to get to the culture. And my preferred definition of culture has always been the way we do things around here.
Mm-hmm.
And the way we do things around here is inextricably linked to the tools that we use every day. If we
one of
use
those
horrible tools, we have a horrible way of working.
I'm sorry. I was just excited. One of the links in the chain we have is platform. If you don't have a good platform, it makes your life hell. You need a good set of tools to work with to make it your life easy.
So I'm going to bring this together. We're all correct. Tools are not the goal. Tools are necessary. The problem where we started to say, don't make it about the tools, was that there was no focus on culture. There was no focus on psychological safety. There was no focus on work in progress. There was no focus on decomposition. There was no focus on those elements. So we said, stop focusing on the tools. We didn't mean to imply tools don't matter, in the same way that Agile was never supposed to mean there is no architecture. It's all going to suddenly emerge as developers just start to work their magic. We've gotten lost along the way because we keep latching on to phonemes. We keep latching on to small bits and pieces and not thinking about, to Chris's point, to your point, tools matter, but that's not the goal. The goal is building products that bring business or mission value. And I need culture, and I need process, and I need tools to enable that to happen.
This is why I keep referencing people back to Donovan Brown's 2015 definition of DevOps, right? Which is the union of people, process, and products to enable the continuous delivery of value to our end users, right? And to your, what we're seeing is like, oh, it's a culture. Every time someone says it's a culture, I point them to a blog post I wrote about Agile deepities. A deepity is something that sounds profound, but doesn't actually mean anything. Or, to your point about, oh, we're going to replace DevOps with platform engineering. I wrote a ranty blog post about that too. It's like platform engineering is like the trunk on an elephant, right? It's part of the DevOps thing. You're pointing out to the one part that you feel comfortable with and saying that's what it is, instead of looking at the entire system and saying it's all of it, right?
But Tracy used a really interesting word just then, focus. And I think we're often kind of too monomaniacal about focusing on just one thing or one thing at a time. I was a bit of a camera geek when I was a kid. And it's like, if you look at how focus works, or autofocus now works, you can have a single spot, or you can have these kind of, multi-array things. And for most pictures, most of the time, you don't actually want that single spot. You want to have a whole wide variety of focus points being taken into account to get the whole of the picture to actually work. And there we seem to get into this kind of monomaniacal thing because of this notion that people can only hold one concept in their heads at a time. And whilst that may be true for a sort of thread of thought, it's not in any way near sufficient for us to deal with the complex environments around us where we're trying to solve problems. And so we can't reduce these things down to these single points. We've got to be considering the whole broad array of the socio-technical systems that we operate within and figuring out the entirety of it. And again, this is where teams come in, because it shouldn't all be just in one person's head either. We can spread the load, and we can pick the people that are better at doing different bits of it.
So we are getting close to the end of our time together. It's almost time for me to refill my coffee. Bryan, if you were to leave our audience with one imperative or one thought to carry forward for today, knowing that there's a universe of things you could say, what would be the first thing that you would recommend to our audience?
Well, I mean, pulling it back to, what we're talking about really is leadership, right? It's like, if you are commanding a situation, right, and you want to be a leader, learn how to be a leader, learn how to get the most out of people. If you are in an environment where you're working for a manager or a commander, and so the leader, quit.
All right. We just saw a mass number of people quitting. So I imagine that after this episode comes out, we're going to see a glut of technologists on the market. Chris, what's your bit of advice for today from this conversation that you would give to people?
I would go with, I wouldn't be so strong as quit. I'd say change your org or change your org. So, sometimes you can be the change. And in terms of how to actually get to that, I know that a petty officer's leadership course in the Royal Navy isn't available to everybody. And I've come across an outfit called Admired Leadership. I found them through the Knowledge Project blog and the podcast on that. And I'd say, take a look at that. That seems to be people who have actually figured out cracking the code of what is leadership and how do we make people better at it. And we were talking earlier about book writing. I think a lot of the time business books are just far too long. They should probably be blog posts. But a lot of the time you can find the author of a business book will come on a podcast and explain all of the good bits. So that's where to find the knowledge. And so I'd say start with that podcast from the Admired Leadership people on the Knowledge Project. There's probably more distilled how to be a better leader in that hour and a half or whatever it is, than there is weeks of going to residential courses or whatever else.
So we will add the links to that when we post this, when we publish out this episode for today. My advice would be the same thing. It's okay to change. Don't have FOMO. Don't fear you're going to miss out. Be open to learning, be open to changing as a leader, be open to helping your leadership to change. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you, Bryan, for being a part of today. To our listeners, if you have comments, if you have questions, send them off to our email address, post them in the comments below, or hit us up on LinkedIn. We'd be glad to talk with you about all these things further. Thanks, and we will catch you again on the next On the Road to DevHops.